Speaking very broadly, there are two ways in which a culture can form identity. What we might roughly call the traditional approach and the modern. For traditional cultures, value, purpose, and meaning are achieved through the fulfillment of one's duty. Thus, the heroic narrative of this approach is one of self-denial, as one sublimates his own personal interests for the good of his community. What that means is that if your father was a blacksmith, and his father was a blacksmith, and his father was a blacksmith, then you're going to be a blacksmith. You have no choice. In fact, if you even try to engage in another field of work, no one from the community will do business with you, because you're a blacksmith. That's your role in society, and the community is depending upon you to fulfill it. Thus, any attempt to avoid such responsibility is deemed dishonorable. Now, historically, there have been only two ways to escape such oppressive identity formation: death, or by moving to America. And so, although you may not have read this in your history textbooks, our country is essentially made up of the descendants of those who rejected the traditional view and had nowhere else to go. And that's why our heroic narrative in the West is not self-denial, but rather self-assertion, which is not just different, as sociologists have noted, it's opposite. Rather than looking outwardly to determine one's place in society, the modern approach to identity reverses the process. Today, identity comes through self-expression, through the autonomous discovery of one's most authentic desires, and then being courageous enough to express those desires and become one's true self. An approach Robert Bellah has called expressive individualism. And much of the time, these self-expressions are actually opposed to what our family and society desire of us. For example, in 2013, famous actor Will Smith's son, Jaden Smith, sought an emancipation ruling for his 15th birthday because he wanted freedom to pursue his true self, which his parents were supposedly stifling. In modern culture, it's heroic to say, "I don't care what my family says, this is who I am."
He doesn't like to make toys.
Do you mind telling me what you do want to do?
Well, sir, someday I'd like to be a dentist.
A dentist?
Herbie the elf doesn't want to be an elf, he wants to be a dentist. And to deny this genuine desire is the most grievous of sins today. So while in traditional cultures the pursuit of such autonomy was viewed as villainy, to us it's heroism. As the great moral philosopher Mariah Carey has told us, in addition to its prevalence in popular music, this modern self-authenticating hero is also found in many feature films. In fact, the narrative has become so pervasive in animated movies that Luke Epplin has taken to calling it the magic feather syndrome. In a recent article for The Atlantic, Epplin explains what he means by this curious phrase. As with the titular character in Walt Disney's 1943 animated feature Dumbo, such movies revolve around anthropomorphized outcasts who must overcome the restrictions of their societies or even species in order to realize their impossible dreams. And almost uniformly, the protagonist's primary liability, such as Dumbo's giant ears, eventually turns into their greatest strength. But first, the character must relinquish the crutch of the magic feather, or more generally, surmount their biggest fears by believing that their greatness comes from within. Epplin gives numerous examples of this magic feather approach to identity from the past decade of animated blockbusters, like a fat panda who hopes to become a kung fu master in Kung Fu Panda, or a sewer-dwelling rat who dreams of becoming a French chef in Ratatouille, or an 8-bit villain who yearns to be a video game hero in Wreck-It Ralph, or an unscary monster who pursues a career as a top-notch scarer in Monsters University, and on we could go. In every one of these films, the hero rejects the identity that has been foisted upon him by society, or even physiology, and instead replaces it with one which is self-determined. Thus, when we compare this contemporary narrative to those of antiquity, a dramatic contrast appears. where it becomes clear that the modern self-assertive hero is diametrically different than his ancient self-denying counterpart. Consider, if you will, the great figure of Aeneas in Virgil's epic narrative, Aeneid. For Aeneas, honor and glory is to be found not in giving full vent to his desires, but rather in sublimating them for the good of his community. Thus, the great character arc of the Aeneid is the struggle of the hero to embrace his sense of pietas, his sense of duty. His life of sacrifice, which he owes not only to the gods, but also to his family, his descendants, and by extension, the future people of Rome. However, this ancient conception of honor, of identity formed through piety, is virtually unknown in contemporary culture. And many think this to be a good thing. Because while the traditional approach may seem very noble, its piety, they argue, is pure fiction. A ruse to rob man of his most valuable resource, the freedom of expression. Thus, whatever good the traditional approach inspires is nullified by a prohibitive methodology which prevents a person from discovering his or her authentic self. Now, while this contemporary critique of the traditional approach to identity has some merit, what is more interesting is that the modern method, in other words, the one which exalts freedom of expression as the preeminent ethic, turns out to be just as enslaving, perhaps even more so. To see this truth, it helps to consider the following illustration, which was first conceived by author Tim Keller. Imagine, if you will, an Anglo-Saxon warrior in Britain in AD 800 who has two very strong inner impulses. One is aggression. He loves to smash and kill people when they show him disrespect. Now, because he lives in a shame-honor culture with its warrior ethic, he will identify with this feeling. He will say to himself, hey, that's me. This is who I want to be, and he will give expression to it. The other feeling he senses is same-sex attraction. To that he will say, whoa, hey, that's not me. And so he will control and suppress that impulse. Now imagine a young man living in Manhattan today. One who has the same two inward impulses, both equally strong, both difficult to control. Which will he choose to be authentic? Well, he will likely look at the aggression and think, well, hey, that's not me. That's not who I want to be. And thus he will seek deliverance in therapy and anger management programs. However, he will look at his sexual desire and conclude, now that is me. Now, what does this thought experiment demonstrate? Well, primarily it reveals that our identity is not simply determined from within. That while we may think that we are sovereignly choosing which desires to express and which to reject, it's our culture who is ultimately making such decisions. All societies impose what Keller calls an interpretive moral grid over our various desires and through which they are sifted. And it is this grid that determines which desires are me and should thus be expressed, and which are not me and thus must be suppressed. So it's this grid of interpretive beliefs, not some innate, unadulterated expression of our feelings, which ultimately shapes our identity. In other words, most of us choose to be the selves our cultures command us to be. So you see, in either approach, whether you take the traditional or the modern, society is dictating to us who we are. The meaning, purpose, and value of your life is determined by the culture in which you live. And yet, innately we know that this approach is terribly insufficient. For our heart not only aches for genuine freedom, but for a sense of self which endures beyond the life of our culture. But if our society is ill-prepared to tell us who we really are, then where will this abiding attestation come from? What interpretive moral grid can guide our hearts to genuine expression, to real flourishing? The truth is, our true identity can only come from the one who made us, our Creator. Only our Father can give us a proper name, and this He has done by naming us after His firstborn Son, Jesus Christ. And it is only by claiming this identity that the truth can be known, a truth that will at last set you free.